All right, welcome to week 12. Uh, this week we'll be looking at the period after the Ur-3 period. So the Ur-3 period, if you remember, was a short period that occurred after the Akkadian Empire. It was a kind of Sumerian Renaissance, Neo-Sumerian period, it's usually called. And the end of the Akkadian Empire is typically where archaeologists draw a line in this region as marking the end of the early Bronze Age. Ur-3 period and the periods we'll be talking about this week are part of the Middle Bronze Age. And then the later periods, periods that are usually associated with the New Kingdom of Egypt and trade in the Mediterranean that we'll talk a little bit about, is the Late Bronze Age. We're going to go past that into the Iron Age as well. But just so you don't get too confused about all these different periods, right? We got the end of the Akkadian period. We had the Gutians who ruled over southern Mesopotamia for a while. Then the Ur-3 period. That's when the famous ziggurat at Ur was built. And now we're getting into a period known as the Larsa period. Archaeologists, as I've said before, are not that creative when it comes to naming different time periods. So this period is called Larsa, not surprisingly, because a city named Isin was dominant for a while, and then a city named Larsa was dominant for a while. At the end of that, we then get into the Old Babylonian period. This is the period of Hammurabi. Okay, so let's look at some of the things that were going on. One of the most important things from the Larsa period is a neighborhood from Ur that was excavated by Leonard Woolley that gives us insight into everyday life in ancient Mesopotamia. Okay, so the dynasty of Isin gained control over a good portion of southern Mesopotamia, and this is similar to the Ur-3 period in terms of the areas that they were controlling, but they didn't control all of the cities to the south. Later on in time, the city of Larsa started to conquer these cities and eventually assumed domination over that territory. So it switched from hegemony from Isin to domination by Larsa. One of the kings of Larsa, in fact, many archaeologists believe that he was the longest reigning king in Mesopotamian history, Rim-Sin. Under him, Larsa really increased its territory. He conquered Isin. And so Isin ruled for a while as the dominant power, as you can see here. Okay, now one of the things that Leonard Woolley did very well was not only patiently waiting till he felt his workers were ready to excavate the royal tombs at Ur, but he also decided to excavate outside of the main area with all of the temples and excavate an area in another part of the city, which was mostly a residential area. We don't really have this in many Mesopotamian cities that have been excavated. A lot of times archaeologists would focus on the very large, important buildings, such as palace or a temple, but not necessarily look at how the everyday or, middle-class citizens actually live. So because Leonard Woolley excavated this area during the Larsa period, we have an idea of how people lived, what their life was like, what their religious life was like. So let's look at some of the things that he found. Well, if you looked at the plan here of this residential area of Ur, most of you would probably not say that this looked very planned at all. And in fact, it probably wasn't planned. It certainly doesn't look planned. There's no grid Streets dead end, right? So you can see several of the streets just kind of, go for a few blocks and then just sort of dead end. Streets are unpaved. There are some drains, but no sewer system as we would think of it. There also was deposits of trash in the streets. To get rid of their trash, the people in this neighborhood would simply go to their front door and open the door and throw the trash right into the street. And so trash and other debris built up in the street, as you're going to see. Okay, so there were lots of wandering streets, blind alleys, and essentially the buildings were created to fit into the space. Streets were not laid out first and then the houses built second. So not planned at all. Well, over time, you can see what happened here. This is street level up here, and this used to be ground level, street level. Before, about 4 feet of trash slowly built up. So essentially, the first floor kind of became the basement, you might say, because of the buildup of trash. And they had to keep putting the sill of the entrance higher and higher. And eventually the doorway would get, so small that they'd have to rebuild it. And there was constant rebuilding. And because of this, it was a little bit tricky to date some of the buildings. Some of the buildings that were actually used at the very same time might be on slightly different levels from each other. So that was a little bit difficult. Also, when a father died, his possessions would pass to his children, and so sometimes these houses would then be subdivided, and that makes it difficult to date as well. Right? But if they didn't raise the sill of the doorway, trash from the street would end up coming into the house. Now, Leonard Woolley named the streets after streets in Oxford. That's where he was educated. And also Bath, England, where he had a home. And so there's streets like Straight Street and Gay Street. And these are just streets that he was familiar with, rather than labeling the streets 1, 2, and 3. This actually worked out better in many respects. Because people could easily find these streets when they were looking at the map, looking at some of his excavation plans. The outer walls were thick, of the homes were thick and solid, good for supporting a second story, which we believe most of the houses did have a second story, and also good for insulation. And I think I've mentioned before that I have lived, when I was an archaeologist in Turkey, in mud brick houses. And mud brick is an excellent building material because it is relatively cool in the summer compared to a lot of other materials. You can see some of the streets and the curves of some of the streets. Right. We're going to look at a couple of houses and also a couple of shrines and some of the things that were found in some of the houses. This might be kind of a medium-sized house, typical of that size, so not the smallest and not the largest, but a fairly sizable house. And you'll see the entrance here. Typically, these houses had a narrow door that led from the street into this kind of vestibule area. It's almost like what we would consider a mudroom. That is, they didn't want the entrance to open directly into the house. That wasn't good for privacy's sake. And also, it would be bad for dust and wind, right? If dust started to blow in and the entrance was directly going from the house to the street, you get all sorts of garbage blowing into the house. So this room had a little drain here, so we could sort of expect that people would come in, take off their shoes or sandals, and wash their feet off before they entered the rest of the house. Now, this is a courtyard. you can see over here. Here's the stairway that would have gone up to the next level. This is a lavatory where there was also a drain, so this is where you might wash up. Kitchen over here, some sort of ritual shrine or chapel, we might say. A guest room, which looks like it was where maybe people would meet guests of from the household, maybe even have them stay as well. And these areas it was unclear as to what exactly they were used for. So you would go from the entrance into this kind of mudroom area and then into the central court. And also it was designed in such a way where passerbys on the street, if the front door was open, would not be able to see into the courtyard and see some of the things that were going on. There are a lot of houses in the Middle East today, historic homes. Again, some I stayed in. I stayed in a house very much designed like this in a city in Turkey called Urfa. It had a central courtyard. In the central courtyard, there actually was a nice tree that grew. Having a central courtyard is really good in terms of air circulation. So, all of these different rooms face the courtyard, and air could actually circulate around and cool off many of the rooms. If this was one solid block with no outdoor space or no courtyard, it would get very hot very quickly. But the courtyard serves as kind of a central part of the house. It sort of links all of the rooms together. It would be traffic going back and forth from different rooms. It was a major activity area, especially in the summer when it's hot. Sometimes there'd be animals living here, maybe a few livestock animals. The surface had baked clay tiles, not just sun-baked, but actually oven-baked, so that they'd be more impervious to water. And there would be kind of a slope to the courtyard so that the water would drain out into this drain here in the center, kind of like what you see in your shower typically. So you can imagine meals that would be occurring here. And there was also a second story. And Leonard Woolley found posts, or the remains of posts, in the courtyard. And so he concluded that there would be this kind of wooden walkway for the second story so that people could move back and forth to the different rooms. Obviously, they can't go across the courtyard there. Right. And this is what you can see, the slope there to the courtyard. And the second story also would have to be the same layout as the first story, because you really couldn't subdivide the rooms in the second story. If you built a wall on the second story that was not supported by a wall directly from the first story, it would not be supported. So we could imagine that the second story would have mimicked the first story pretty much exactly. Okay, so around the court were the domestic rooms and then the stairway leading to the roof. Again, when I lived in Turkey, we all slept on the roof in the summer. It was much, much cooler. Things really cool down at night, especially when you don't have a lot of cloud cover. The heat just radiates back up to the sky, back up to the atmosphere. And it could get quite cool at night, and actually it's very nice to sleep on the roof at night. You're protected from animals, since you're high up. You can see the stars. It's beautiful. So around the courtyard were these different rooms, right? And again, we know that the roof was probably an important area, and this was most likely the guest room or reception room. Things were very crowded. This is probably what it looked like, so it's probably very messy. As we're going to see, there was a lot of childhood mortality in this neighborhood. Not too surprising, considered how cramped people were in together. The ground floor would have the kitchen. Usually they would find the oven in that area. Right? Again, we talked about the second story here. The post holes supported the idea of a walkway. One house actually had walls thick enough to support a third story. Some of these houses also had sheds or yards in the back that would have had animals, most likely. Some houses would have had chapels or shrines at the rear of the house. These were typically the larger houses, but there were also neighborhood shrines as well that we're going to see. The chapel or shrine usually had a long brick-paved room. It might be one of the largest in the house, and it would usually have an altar at one end of it. Right here, you can see the altar in Paternoster Row, and if since there was not a lot of light, they probably used small clay lamps with wicks floating in oil to light their way. Well, what about furniture? Well, we don't get a lot of the furniture preserved, but we do have clay terracotta models that were, used for, we think, decoration, but also protection and sort of magic. And we're going to talk about that give us an idea of what some of the furniture might have looked like, right? So you can see a cloth or leather covered, looks almost like a folding stool, and a bed. Now, they found a lot of infant burials in many of these houses. Infant mortality was high. Typically, infants were buried inside of jars and then buried beneath the floor. Adults would be buried in a vaulted tomb under the floor of the chapel. If they weren't buried there, they would be buried in graves found under the floor of any room in the house. But usually they were around that sort of chapel or shrine area. You can see this is what's known as a corbelled vault. This is before ancient people were able to develop the arch that we're so used to with a keystone. Before they developed that, what they would do is just to kind of stagger the walls course by course slowly inward until they met at the top. Of course, there would have to be a lot of support on either side. You would not have a lot of space. It would not be a very large arch, but this was one way to kind of create an empty space beneath an area and be able to support that empty space. You couldn't just have, wood beams, and you couldn't obviously have bricks lying across here. So you kind of had to stagger things in. And this allowed them to create these vaults to bury family members underneath the house. So because they're buried near the chapel, we get a little bit of an idea of some of the religious beliefs and maybe an idea that ancestors were venerated still at this point in Mesopotamian history. When the chamber was full, the clay coffins would be used to bury people. Most people were not buried with many grave goods, usually a cylinder seal, some jewelry, and maybe a pottery vessel or two. And that's about it. This is an example of, you can see a chapel that was part of a neighborhood, not associated specifically with anyone's home. And these chapels were not for the main gods of the city. These were for lesser gods that were designed to meet the religious needs of ordinary people. The main temple in Ur for Nana, the moon god, was run by the priests, and most average citizens were not allowed near there. So it really didn't make sense to, you probably couldn't pray directly to Nana. What you would do is pray to a lesser deity who would be able to intervene on your behalf and help you, right? And was more accessible to you. And a lot of these small temples, small chapels were supported by local funds, by the people. So these were probably important in the everyday life because they found lots of votive objects, in these shrines or chapels. So you can imagine, going off to work in the fields or going somewhere else. At the beginning of your day or at the end of the day, you might stop off at the chapel and offer something before the deity and seek protection or favor or who knows what. And just as you could not meet the king directly without an introduction from somebody else, you could not talk directly to a main god like Nana or Enlil without having an intermediary. And so this lower level divinity might intercede with the main divinity on your behalf. And this is depicted frequently on cylinder seals from the time, where this is probably the owner of the cylinder seal. This is kind of a lesser deity, lower ranking deity. And here's the main god. Right? And so you can see that the person is sort of being brought before the main god by this lower level deity. And so we get an idea of everyday people in Ur, their everyday lives, which looked like it was pretty tough in terms of sanitation, was not great. Sort of their local religious traditions, what they would do, since they could not worship in the main temple, they had their own temples and their own lower level deities. Okay, next we're going to look at trade and we're going to combine it from what we looked at in the early dynastic and the Akkadian, and the Ur III, and including this period.